A very warm welcome to my community. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. As always, I'm pleased that you could join us. Now, we have often been told that the tradesmen of Barbados built this island. At a time when very few could afford the ready-made stuff, tradesmen kept the many faucets and utensils and other gadgets, in a sense, well-oiled and working for many households. Rose begins this episode by honoring the tradesmen of her community.
We had tinsmiths at that time. So when my mother had her pot and the handle break off, she used to tell us to go down there. She used to, and we hated that. The sun, and it seems to me she used to wait till the sun is the hottest time of the day. Put on your hat and carry this pot to the tinsmith. I can't remember his name now. He used to live down there probably in Weeks Land. We had to carry the pots down there to him. We also had a blacksmith in the area when I was young, maybe like 10, 11. I can't remember his name, but we used to, but his son is still alive now. He's in his 90s. His name was Leo. And I always wondered why this man's shop used to smell like this. And his clothes always used to be dirty, dirty, dirty. But he was a blacksmith. We had that blacksmith, and his son, Leo, who is still alive today, Leo Denny, he was the man who worked on my parents' mahogany chairs. In those years now, people didn't have these big, fluffy furniture. Everybody had mahogany chairs. And I still have mahogany chairs that Leo Denny built in 1958. I still have them at home. So Leo was the, what we would call him now. He used to repair the mahogany chairs and polish them. Not like how people do them now with spraying something. I don't like that. He used to do he used to go and buy the things to do it from the shop in town. I think they still selling the turpentine and wherever else. And he used to mix that polish in a cloth. And he was use sandpaper and sand down the chairs, and this would be done mostly at Christmas time. So he would come, or he would take the chairs and carry them and bring them back. And let me tell you, when them chairs come back, nobody can sit down in them till Christmas morning. She ain't putting them up in the house like people used to do in the roof and all that. They stay right there, but nobody is to sit in those mahogany chairs. So we had the tinsmith and we had a blacksmith. We also had a carpenter who lived in the area. His name was Carlisle Legal. His house is still there. His children still live, some of his children still live there, which would be my cousins. And he was the carpenter for the village. Whenever a board wanted fixing, a roof needed this, my father and my mother would always call Carlisle. He was also the painter. He would always paint. And in those days, people had their little wooden houses, and they used to spruce them up at different times of the year, but mostly at Christmas time, a new coat of paint would go on the houses. And another activity that we used to do too would be going to the sea. Now, my mother was very particular about going to the sea. That is why I gotta go and learn to swim now. Because nobody come past and say, hey, Rosemary, we going to the sea, come. That won't work. We could only go to the sea with our parents. And I have a story to tell about going to the sea. My father used to take us to the sea on Sunday mornings. He used to ride a bicycle because it was just there in Brandon. And that one particular morning, my father picked me up. Well, not picked me up, took me, we went, left the house and we went going to the sea, riding down Bridge Gap. And I looking at the bicycle spokes going round and round. And I pushed my toe in the bicycle spoke, and all the flesh off of my toe come off. My father was so mad. Can't get this. He had to turn back and carry me back home. But going to the sea was always fun for us. We only could go with our parents. But the unfortunate thing was that the parents used to tell that the sea ain't got in the back door. So I did not learn to swim. So I plan in next month now to go and learn to swim. Because of my parents' fear, I did not learn to swim. But yes, we used to go to the sea, and the special time of going to the sea would be at Christmas time. We had a box cart. So we used to leave home like 5 o'clock in the morning and go to Brandon. At that time, there was a lot of, I guess there was a reef there. So in the months of November and December, there would be a lot of gravel on the beach. So we would pick up the gravel, that would be broken reef, put it in the box cart and come back up. And you know that gravel and sand was sprinkled around the house for Christmas. But that is what we used to do with the box cart. And you know, in those days it would be dark, so we used to, I can't remember if they used to use a lamp or what, but pushing the box cart, everybody walking down to the sea and walking back. So that was really something that I enjoyed, going to the sea only with my parents. Can't go with no friends.
Festive occasions were a reason to celebrate with new decorative items and additional foodstuff. Rose looks back at 2 festive seasons and how her family marked those occasions.
My mother used to have new curtains at Christmas. New curtains at Christmas. And my mother was a seamstress, so she would make her own curtains. And for Christmas, for us, we would all have new dresses. And the dresses would always be white with a red sash, and white socks and black patent leather shoes. That is what we used to get for Christmas. And my father used to have, at Christmas time, we would have 2 hams. And these hams were the old-time hams. They used to come in a bag, a cloth bag, and they used to hang them up in the roof of the kitchen. And my father would get these hams like, could be like 3 weeks before Christmas. But you know, with the heat, they would start gifting, and as children we used to go and hit the bottom of the ham and get some of the juice out of the bag, and then we would lick our, children or something else, we would lick our hands, licking the salt from the ham. But that is what my father would do for us at Christmas. And the other thing, for Easter, it would be a yellow dress. Easter Sunday, and we at that time were not Catholics. We used to go to Gill Memorial, which would be where the police station in Black Rock is now, the new police station. A big church was there, Gill Memorial, and that was our church. We were Methodists at that time. I don't know what made my mother make the switch to the Catholic Church, but we were Methodists and we would go to Gill Memorial.
The Ann Gill Memorial Methodist Church eventually moved further north and today occupies a spot on the Fairfield Crossroad, Black Rock in St. Michael. What about the itinerant trader, those who visited the community and sold their produce? I
remember I think she was my mother's great aunt. Her name was Hortense, but we used to call her Old Hearts. And she used to come around with a basket on her head. She used to wear a white apron, very white apron, but she used to sell ball starch. Yes, she used to come around, but she was from the Baltic in St. Peter. So I don't know if she used to walk from the Baltic because in those days they hadn't many buses or anything. So Old Hearts would come up with her basket on her head with her ball starch. The ball starch that Hortense used to sell, Old Hearts would sell, was made from cassava. So you grated the cassava and you put the grated cassava now in a cloth and you squeeze it and leave that to sit out there in the sun. And the water would evaporate and the starch would form at the bottom. So that starch was used to starch your clothes. So up to today, I don't use spray starch. And I think she'd be saying starch, starch, starch. And people would come out and buy this starch. And my mother used to see her or know when she's coming because she liked coffee. So my mother would always put on a pot of coffee. And in those days, drinking coffee, nobody knew about the coffee. But my mother used to prepare coffee for Old Hearts, Hortense, when she comes up. There is another lady who was part of my life. Her name is Ernesta Graves. And she even made some starch for me. She's 93 or 94, or I think she's 94 now. And she made some starch for me a couple of years ago. And she kept it, and I only received it maybe like a couple of months ago, and it's still as good. And she made that years ago. So yeah, you can make your own starch. And when you starch with that ball starch, your things are starched properly starched. So that's what used to starch my African prints, the cotton fabrics. And yes, people used to drive around selling fish. I mean flying fish. I don't 10 cents for one, all sorts of things. And at Eagle Hall Corner, over on the other side of the market, when it was sea egg time, these women come down from, I guess, St. Joseph and St. John with these big baskets on the head. And they might not go to Eagle Hall Corner early. They might walk around. Sea eggs! Sea eggs! Sea eggs! Then you come a sea egg, must see for $1. And I mean, the sea eggs used to be big. I remember my mother sending me up Eagle Hall Corner to buy the sea eggs from the ladies. So when they come, the sea eggs used to be warm. And they used to wrap them in a grape leaf. And I used to take off the grape leaf, pinch off the top that up in the point, and eat it, and put it back on, and stick back in the, and carry home the sea eggs to my mother. But yes, people used to walk around selling all kinds of things. I remember the sea eggs for sure, and the flying fish. People used to walk around selling that. But I think my father, but in those days, even like now, I would not buy fish from anybody driving around selling. But in those days, the fish used to be really fresh, and my parents knew fresh fish. So when they came around, you buy 50 flying fish, 100 flying fish, and you only pay a few dollars for it, not like now. But yeah, people used to come around selling. And when I was a child, there was a man called Barney who used to sell what people call snow cones now, but we used to call them snowballs. Oh my God, Barney's snowballs were the best. And I talking about now when I was about 5, 6, 7, because he only used to come out on Sundays. And Barney's the syrup that he put on the snowball, it wasn't like what people selling now, sugar water with dye. It used to be a syrup that he used to pour. And when I was in Suriname a couple of years ago, I saw exactly the same thing. Somebody shaving ice, and the person pouring on the syrup, and that really brought back memories for me as a child. But Barney used to come around on Sundays, and he had a bell that he used on his cart that he would hit. And we used to say, Daddy Pong Pong coming. So when we tell my father about Daddy Pong Pong coming, he know that Barney was coming down the road with his snowballs, and he would send us out with a big enamel cup, and we would buy that snowball. Oh my God, I would die for one now. And that really made me remember really my childhood, those little things.
And it's very important that we share those little things that made us who we are. Now, speaking of little things, let us learn now of experiences of baking and the type of oven that was used.
Now, a lot of people in them 60s, early 60s, didn't have a stove at home with an oven. So people used to carry their bread and cakes. And I remember my mother, but for a short time, because my father was a very proactive person. So I remember for a short time, my mother would take her cakes at that bakery to bake. But you know, in those days, people used to say, oh, not only the cakes, used to take the meat there too. Because there's a joke I hear my Uncle Grantley saying, because he was a baker boy in those days, that when people bring the turkey and the pork and everything to bake, they used to get the bread, and as the turkey is baking, they press their bread on the turkey. Which is taking out all the juice. So when this woman came to collect her turkey, she couldn't understand why this turkey so dry. But she didn't know that the baker boys was pressing her turkey with bread and eating the substance and giving her just the dry turkey meat. But yes, people would go and carry their stuff there to bake. But my mother then, soon after, my father bought my mother this little oven and a primer stove she had. But this oven used to sit on top of the primer stove, and she could only bake one cake at a time. So in those days, they used to be up all night just to give their children a sense of Christmas or whatever, they would sit up all night in we used to call the shed roof of the house. They would sit down and watch each cake bake one by one by one, because you could only put in one cake at a time.
Wow, we have certainly come a long way. You would recall Rose speaking of the snowball a few moments ago. Well, here's a learning exercise in geopolitics that followed the eating of those snowballs on Sundays.
And the other thing my father used to do, and I remember as a child, on Sundays too, after we get the snowball, my father would get a map of the world and put it on the floor in the front house. And he would sit down and show us Israel. He said, listen, this is where Israel is. Don't mind people telling you at the church that Israel is somewhere in heaven. Israel ain't nowhere in heaven. It's right here on earth. This is where it is. He would tell us about the cutting up of Africa by the Europeans. I heard my father talking about the Nuremberg trials. All these sorts of things. Oh, this probably engendered in me this love for history, because my father was well versed in the geopolitics of the day. He would talk to me about Dedan Kimathi. He would talk to me about Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba, what was done to the people in the Belgian Congo. And I mean, I was 7, 8. It was very small. But I remember these names and these things from my father telling us. And we had to go to the public library every Saturday morning and get books. Books, books, books. We had to read, we had to read, we had to read. That is one thing I can say about my time growing up in Eagle Hall in Goodland. You had to go to the library. And the library, it was not the Eagle Hall library that I got. No, you had to go in town to the public library on Saturday morning. So that was a kind of outing for the children in the area. Had to go to the public library.
Well, that's one of the reasons why the public library has often been referred to as the People's University. Now, have you ever heard of a very good cricketer from the area whose surname was Clark? Well, he was Rose's father.
It's interesting that you're asking about my father's cricket prowess, because only a few weeks ago I was having a conversation with Ralph Thorne, he and the attorney at law, and he was telling me about a conversation he was having with Professor Don Marshall about my father. Yes, in the 1950s, I think, my father, they were having cricket trials for people to go and play for the West Indies. And my father was working at Mount Gay at the time. He had one child at the time, my oldest sister Judy, and I guess he asked his boss or whoever, tell him what was happening, and said well, he would like to go and try out. And the boss probably tell him, well, you can't go. If you go, it's either cricket or your job. And in those days, having a young family, as my father would say to me, he couldn't think about no cricket. He had to think about staying at home. So my father did not go, didn't have the opportunity to play. And Conrad Hunt got his place. And my father was never bitter about that. Never bitter about it. And it's interesting that my father never spoke about it. It was the late Don Norville who told me as an adult this story about my father and cricket, what a great cricketer my father was. My father never talked about it. I was never bitter about it. Even when we found out, then we said, well, Daddy, well, you never say it. But he never talked about it. But yes, I understand he was a fantastic cricketer, and no less than the Right Excellent Sir Garfield Sobers, who he always said was his friend, mentioned that recently too, that he was one of the great cricketers that would have come out of Barbados, but because of conditions, poverty, socioeconomic conditions, my father never had the opportunity to play. But my father had a good life, and it's interesting enough that his grandson now, who is Jay Clark, he is playing cricket in Barbados today. So the legacy is still living on in his grandchildren.
Let us now celebrate this interesting story of community members who give and give and give.
In my younger years, before I started school, there was a lady called Mrs. Richards. She lived next door. She was Albertina Richards and her husband was Edwin Richards. And he was a baker. And in those days, people shared a lot what they had, whatever little they had. They didn't have a lot, but what they had, they shared. And Mr. Richards used to bake sweet bread. And I could smell that sweet bread breaking now. And his wife would push open the window because they didn't have any children. And she would say, Clarky, come here at the window for this thing. And either I would go or my mother would go just a few meters away and collect whatever sweet bread or sweet potatoes, because he had a donkey cart and he used to sell sweet potatoes as well. And Mrs. Richards liked to teach. So before I went to school, I knew letters and I was able to recognize numbers and all that because she used to teach me. In those days, they had a slate and I would go over by her house and she would teach me how to write out my letters and write out my numbers. And another lady who lived in the neighborhood was a nurse. Her name was, we used to call her Miss Dorothy Ramsey. She retired as the matron of the hospital. She was one of the people who lived in our area too. And I remember seeing Miss Ramsey in her white uniform. I was just wondering, what is this woman in white? But then you realize that she was a nurse and she worked at the hospital. Then there was another family that we lived like sisters and brothers. It was Kenrick and Basil and Heather, and their mother we used to call Lily. And we used to live, people used to share everything. In those days too, when me and Heather, we would be young women. She would be older than I was. We used to even wear each other's clothes. Like if somebody got somewhere to go and they don't have something and it could fit you, you can go and wear that. So it was that kind of community that was shared in that little village.
Perhaps we could regard it as a community-spirited community. The concept of giving, sharing, caring, and looking out for the interests of your neighbors, which incidentally is the hallmark of this series, My Community. Oh yes, there's so much that we could learn from the experiences of those days when many of our neighborhoods were communities in the truest sense of the word. Thank you very much, Rose, for sharing those wonderful memories. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. The series My Community continues next week at the same time. In the meantime, do take good care of yourself and